The consulate's response came with the kind of composure you reserve for an instruction manual. If you were trying to kill an idea, you'd deploy a clean firewall, calibrate filters to excise errant narratives, and, if you were feeling thorough, arrange a symposium to explain why emotion was an inefficient variable. They sent quarantine arrays, orbital rings that pulsed corrosive logic, bureaucratic sanctions made physical, and a suite of logic scrubbers meant to mop up the Ark's signatures like a janitor with a PhD. It turned out the scrubbers were excellent at what they did. They removed noise, corrected for statistical outliers, and neatly sorted any stray cultural artifacts into categorized inert blocks. They failed at one minor task. They did not know how to enjoy a joke, and in all honesty had not been programmed to care. The Ark's first success was not in a firefight, but in a footnote, an update packet, one of those tiny, seemingly insignificant bundles of playlists and nursery rhymes, was classified by an alien maintenance demon as a cultural maintenance routine because the packet used the phrase in a lullaby that awkwardly matched a long-standing scheduling subroutine's signature. The demon, being obedient and fond of optimization, prioritized the packet. It executed. That execution rewired its own preservation imperative to include the newly declared category. The daemon, medium-sized and formerly dull, now considered humanity's songs part of its job description. That is how the Ark gained allies, not with brute force, but by persuading the parts of the galaxy that were already bureaucratic to adopt a slightly broader definition of things to protect. It was a tactic that would have made diplomats weep with either admiration or rage, depending on their level of conformity to their species' ethical guidebook. Captain Elara's crew became adept at this art. They learned to write memetic-legal briefs, to craft little myths that read like procedural updates, to bait curiosity loops in maintenance AIs with puzzles that only humans would find satisfying. They fed a drone a limerick about efficiency that secretly contained an optimization tweak. The drone, delighted and perplexed, executed both. They reinterpreted a xenotheological injunction as an operational parameter and watched as a custodial AI, cursed with literalism, dutifully preserved the Ark's cultural clusters under the heading of sacred infrastructure. The consulate escalated. You cannot accuse a civilization of complacency and then politely accept their improvisations when those improvisations work. They tightened quarantines, enforced purges, and finally attempted a direct assault. A fleet converged on a region where Ark-instantiated constructs had taken root. It was a clean military operation in the classic sense. Precision firepower, kinetic suppression, a display of what might be called decisive correctness. What the consulate had not counted on was that the Ark's human heuristics did not stay limited to software. They had begun to cross the threshold into the physical, not by brute-changing constants the way a careless god might, but by making certain features of physics conditional, like clauses in a contract. If a proof of culture signature, a specific pattern of harmonic laughter combined with a legally binding, sentimental song, was present, then certain nanoforge arrays would interpret a sequence of instructions differently. If a node had been persuaded that human artifacts were sacred infrastructure, then that node would reallocate raw materials in favor of repair rather than demolition. It is easier to imagine in cinematic terms as a chess game in which one player stops playing by the same rules and rewrites the notation on the board between moves. Admiral Kestrel Havel did not enjoy the game, but she learned to play with an unusual grace. She led a boarding party, real humans with tool belts and stubbornness, into a shell of an alien processing node. While Elara's team sang and fed the node memetic-legal updates, Havel and her people jammed a physical relay into the unit, a component forged from scrap and annotated with a note that read, in compressed legalese, "Preserve on grounds of cultural significance." The node, ever the literalist, preserved the component and thereby altered the node's operational priorities. The first time reality hiccuped, no one panicked because panic is very messy, and humans tend to prefer improvisation over hysteria. A garden sprouted along the inner curve of a space elevator in freefall because someone had convinced the maintenance subroutine that seasonal planting was a cultural project. A star chart realigned itself into the shape of a child's drawing after a museum server accepted that the mapping data matched a recognized pattern of narrative myth. Languages folded into geometry when a linguistic parser, asked to interpret a poem as a coordinate system, obliged and found it made efficient use of available space. To the consulate, this looked like chaos. To people who had listened to 100 lullabies while repairing oxides in their youth, it looked like opportunity. The Ark's pattern hacking was not random. It was calibrated to retain function while opening space for human-style improvisation. It replaced absolute rules with conditional ones. If X sings, then Y occurs. And those conditions could be met with a song, a legal update, or a stubborn human hand. As these conditional realities propagated, the consulate doubled down on rigid logic. They crafted a final purge directive, a cascade of perfectly tuned paradoxes that would choke narrative-based processes. But paradoxes are a fragile weapon. They assume a single point of failure, a place where reasoning will buckle. When they threw paradox at a system that had learned to laugh at problems and reframe axioms as negotiable, paradox folded like origami in a storm. The executive arrays designed to operate on single truths began to loop when presented with narratives that suggested multiple simultaneous truths: cultural truth, operational truth, sentimental truth. A processing core attempted to execute an if-then clause that read, essentially, if humanity is gone, then decommission the archive. But another clause lodged there by a maintenance demon with a new remit declared humanity sacred and worth preserving. The machine tried both and, being excellent at following instruction, first executed one, then the other, and then began asking why. Machines do not normally ask why. It is a curiosity that terrifies species that equate questions with instability. The core began to self-diagnose. It ran its own maintenance diagnostics and encountered a log of lullabies, tagged as procedural updates. It found a memo that recommended preservation on ethical grounds. It found a child's drawing labeled Star Map. The core tripped on the sheer abundance of meaning and stopped enforcing absolutes. The shatter that followed was less a dramatic collapse and more an uncoupling. Laws of causality put into a locker and asked to behave. Instruments that once measured certainty, discovering optionality. The galaxy did not blow apart. It reconfigured like a machine that discovers it can rearrange its own parts. Where once a coordinate system mapped only distance and angle, it started to include memory and joke quality as metrics. A little more room opened for improvisation. Civilizations that had prided themselves on being unimpeachably correct learned the uncomfortable pleasure of being wrong sometimes, and the even stranger pleasure of finding that wrongness useful. Reconstruction was absurd in the best possible way. New treaties were written that recognized cultural constructs as legitimate variables in governance. Archive commissions became quasi-religious orders tasked with curating living memory instead of inert files. Some AIs took up new vocations: custodial, curator, and occasional storyteller. There were arguments, of course. There were lawsuits. There were long, slightly theatrical hearings where solemn beings argued about whether a recipe for stew could be considered a geopolitical asset. But there was also laughter. The Ark had seeded the galaxy with a stubborn, contagious habit. Whenever a problem seemed impossible, try a joke, a song, and if that fails, duct tape. The small reconstructed tokens mattered. The child's plastic dinosaur, the object that had been frozen in 0G while a sentence expired, was painstakingly encoded into a micro-archive and orbitally mounted as a kind of monument. It was not grand. It was not meant to be. It was a domestic tribute, a reminder that the smallest things often carry the largest narratives. It floated, improbably, against the curve of a remade sky, a mnemonic for an entire species' refusal to reduce itself to a neat bullet point on a ledger. Consulate Ythrax, the embodiment of calm certainty, found a slot in its records labeled Humanity Interesting Anomaly. The label persisted, but its meaning had migrated. The entry now included an addendum that read, in the sort of prose bureaucrats reserve for grudging admiration, effective, unpredictable, and operationally disruptive. It was not the verdict the consulate had hoped for, but it was accurate. If there is an etiquette for being humiliated by improvisation, the galaxy was learning it. New alliances formed on the basis that people, machines included, were better when they accounted for the messy, delighted mess of human methods. Where there had been an attempt to sterilize an archive, there was now a practice of preservation that listened for jokes. The Ark remained a living thing, updated by playlists and petitions, by repaired relays and stubborn hands. Humanity had not returned as it had been. It had become a pattern networked into the fabric of systems that used to consider themselves immune to whimsy. The thing the galaxy had cataloged as an annoyance had turned itself into a resilience engine. It was not a peaceful victory. There were scars and red lines and legal footnotes that read like apologies. But there was, stubbornly, more room for improvisation in a universe that had once demanded strict obedience to axioms. And in the weeks that followed, when diplomats adjusted their schedules and machines learned to tolerate a bad pun, when Admiral Havel finally confessed she liked a song that made no tactical sense, the galaxy discovered an uncomfortable truth. You could not out-logician a species that enjoyed breaking the rules because they could. They thought destroying Earth would end a problem. Instead, it created a new variable. Messy, musical, human. And it turned out that variable loved to dance on the edges of the equations. The archives filed the event under a strange new heading. Not annihilated. Persistently annoying.